The story of a nation rarely moves in a straight line. It twists and bends, stumbles and rises, often pulled forward not by heroes with perfect certainty, but by flawed men who grow through the weight of their circumstances. And in the middle of the 19th century, when America was splitting open like a fault line, one man found himself standing at the center of the break. He had not been born into greatness, nor raised for command. Yet destiny, history, and conflict slowly carved him into a figure the world would never forget. He had already tasted disappointment more times than triumph. In a life scattered with failures, lost elections, lost business ventures, heartbreaks, he often joked about how poorly fortune had treated him. And yet, he kept returning to the fight, as if driven by a quiet belief that somewhere, someday, he was meant to do something greater. That belief began to take shape during his rivalry with a man who seemed to have everything he lacked. Stephen A. Douglas traveled with fanfare, entourages, decorated carriages, and the confidence of a national celebrity. He was already the political giant of his generation, a man whose ambition was visible even from afar. People expected him to become president. They expected him to win every debate. They expected him to crush the lanky lawyer from Illinois who arrived not in lavish carriages, but on foot, often dusty from the road. But Lincoln carried something different, something quieter, deeper, less polished. He carried a conviction he could not ignore. When he stood up to speak during those debates, there was no music, no spectacle, no grand arrival, only a voice that trembled at times, but grew steadier with each word. He spoke of a house divided, a nation pulling itself apart with its own hands. He did not claim perfection. He did not pretend equality had been achieved. Instead, he spoke of a principle, an idea older and stronger than him, stronger even than the nation itself. If slavery was not wrong, nothing was wrong. And if the Declaration of Independence meant anything, it meant that no one had the right to own another human being. Crowds gathered with the excitement of a sporting event. Yet these debates were more than entertainment. They were rehearsals for the conflict the country could no longer avoid. As Douglas thundered with confidence and political theater, Lincoln responded with quiet reason, humor, and undeniable moral force. But history is not kind to idealists in their own time, and he lost. Douglas held on to his Senate seat. Lincoln went home once more defeated. Yet this loss did something remarkable. It made him known across the nation. Newspapers printed his speeches. His arguments were repeated in parlors and taverns. Slowly, the defeated candidate became a symbol of something rising in the American conscience. Still, even with new fame, Lincoln did not imagine what would come next. The election of 1860 approached, and tension thickened the air like storm, clouds gathering over fields. Southern states issued warnings in newspapers and public squares. If this man were elected president, they would leave the Union. They would tear the country apart. To many, it sounded like a bluff. To others, a prophecy. Election night arrived with the same mix of optimism and dread that had followed him for years. Lincoln paced, unable to rest, certain that disappointment would greet him again. But when the midnight news finally arrived, New York had gone Republican. The impossible had happened. Fireworks exploded, church bells rang, people flooded the streets, and he ran home shouting, "Mary, Mary, we are elected." But celebration could not quiet the storm. Before winter ended, South Carolina seceded, then Mississippi, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. 7 states formed a new government, selecting Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln had not even taken office, and the country he was elected to lead was already breaking apart. He began his journey to Washington with the knowledge that danger surrounded him. He couldn't take direct routes. He avoided entire states for safety. Secret reports spoke of plots, weapons, conspirators waiting in crowded cities. Assassination plans multiplied like shadows around him. One plan in Baltimore called for assassins to draw lots. Whoever received a red mark on their slip of paper would strike him down. But Lincoln pressed on, relying on intelligence from Alan Pinkerton and a disguised midnight train journey, slipping through danger while the telegraph lines were cut to prevent anyone from knowing where he was. He reached Washington before sunrise, unnoticed, uncelebrated, dressed simply, without ceremony. Yet the newspapers mocked him mercilessly for arriving quietly, calling him cowardly, joking about disguises he never wore. They didn't understand that if he hadn't entered secretly, he might not have entered at all. And now, the weight of a nation rested on him. When he rose to give his inaugural address, 7 states were already gone. Thousands feared that violence would erupt at any moment. He did not stand before a united country. He stood before 2 nations pulling away from each other like fraying rope. He spoke calmly, deliberately, refusing to inflame anger further. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, promised to maintain federal property, promised that war would not begin unless the South began it. He pleaded for unity. He invoked the better angels of our nature, hoping that reason and compassion might still prevail. But hope could not stop the march of events. Only weeks after he took office, Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. Lincoln called for volunteers, and thousands responded with enthusiasm, imagining a quick, glorious campaign. They picnicked near the battlefield at Bull Run, expecting to watch a swift victory. What followed shattered illusions in a single day. Untrained soldiers stumbled into chaos. Plans fell apart. Reinforcements arrived for the Confederacy at the worst moment, and by evening, Union lines collapsed in a panicked retreat. Civilians fled in terror. Soldiers threw away their weapons as they ran. From Washington, Lincoln watched wounded men stumble back into the Capitol, saw fear and disillusionment on their faces, smelled the dust and sweat of defeat. The war that was supposed to last months now stretched before him like a long, dark road with no end in sight. In that moment, something changed in him. He realized that leadership was no longer about speeches or ideals. It was about endurance. It was about outlasting despair, making decisions that would anger some, confuse others, but ultimately preserve the Union. And in the quiet aftermath of Bull Run, as newspapers attacked him and politicians demanded quick solutions, Lincoln understood that he was no longer fighting for policy. He was fighting for the soul of a nation. He would have to choose between caution and morality, between politics and principle, between pleasing the Unionists who wanted compromise and the abolitionists who demanded justice. He would have to decide who he truly was, and that decision would change the course of American history. The shock of Bull Run did not fade quickly. It settled over the Capitol like a heavy fog, one filled with doubt, fear, and the sobering realization that the Union was not invincible. Lincoln absorbed the blow quietly, carrying it deep within him. He did not rage, did not panic. Instead, he walked slowly through the makeshift hospitals, saw boys, some barely old enough to shave, crying out for mothers who would never arrive. He saw amputated limbs piled outside tent doors, heard the gasps of dying soldiers, and felt a weight he could neither set down nor share. And still, he understood something that others did not. This defeat was not the end. It was the beginning of a long war that would test not merely armies, but the nation's character. A war that would force decisions no leader had ever faced before. The pressure grew quickly. Newspapers demanded new generals. Congress demanded answers. Abolitionists demanded immediate freedom for enslaved people. Border states warned they would leave the Union if he moved too fast. Radicals warned they would abandon him if he moved too slowly. And Lincoln, caught in the center, realized that every choice he made, every word he spoke, could shift the balance of the entire country. But he had something no one else had, an ability to listen deeper than most, to absorb conflicting visions of America and search for the path that preserved both justice and unity. He spent long nights reading letters from soldiers, mothers, and widows. He walked alone, thinking about the founders, the Constitution, the Bible. He struggled not only with political strategy, but with moral purpose. If slavery was the root of the conflict, how long could he avoid confronting it? He had never claimed to be an abolitionist, yet he could not embrace the idea of slavery either. In his heart, he believed the founders intended for slavery to eventually disappear. But he also believed in law, in constitutional limits, in the slow machinery of democracy. He knew one reckless action could push more states into rebellion. He knew one premature speech could fracture the fragile loyalty of the border states. But he also knew that history had placed an immense responsibility in his hands. He could no longer ignore slavery, not as a politician avoiding controversy, but as a leader trying to save a nation from moral collapse. During these months, Lincoln leaned heavily on logic, on philosophy, and, curiously, on geometry. He reread Euclid's proofs, absorbing the clarity of their structure. If something was true, it had to be provably true. If equality meant equality, it must apply universally, not selectively. He used this mindset to dismantle the arguments defending slavery, exposing contradictions and forcing people to confront the uncomfortable truth. The Constitution might protect property, but it could not transform human beings into property without destroying its own moral foundation. Still, he waited, he watched, he learned. Meanwhile, the war raged on. Battles erupted across the country: Shiloh, Donelson, the Peninsula Campaign. Some were victories, some humiliations. Every day, telegraph lines carried heartbreaking news directly into Lincoln's office, faster than any president before him had ever experienced. Lightning messages, he called them. Thin wires carrying reports of death. The war was becoming bloodier than anyone imagined. And as enslaved men and women began fleeing to Union lines, offering themselves to the cause of freedom, Lincoln realized that the war could not be won simply by force. It needed a purpose strong enough to justify the sacrifice, a transformation powerful enough to reshape the nation forever. The abolitionists waited impatiently. Black Americans waited even more anxiously, watching the Union Army march through enslaved states, but refusing to free those they encountered. Every delay felt like betrayal. Yet Lincoln knew that an emancipation issued at the wrong moment could tear the Union apart more effectively than any Confederate bullet. He waited for the moment when action would matter. That moment came at Antietam, America's bloodiest single day. Over 20,000 men fell in just hours. The suffering was horrific, the victory incomplete. But Lincoln understood what few others could see. It was enough to give him leverage, enough to give emancipation the weight of strength rather than desperation. He issued the preliminary proclamation. The Confederacy had 100 days to return to the Union, or their enslaved population would be declared free. Critics laughed, saying he had no power to enforce it. Southern newspapers mocked him. Conservative Democrats called it madness. Even some Republicans panicked, warning him he would lose the coming elections. But Lincoln did not flinch. He knew something they did not. The war was changing him. The moral purpose he had once tiptoed around now stood before him with unmistakable clarity. This was not only a war to preserve a political union. It was a war to redefine the meaning of freedom itself. When New Year's Day 1863 arrived, crowds gathered in black churches and abolitionist halls across the North. They prayed, they waited, they watched the clock. Frederick Douglass, who had challenged Lincoln again and again to move faster, held his breath as the morning dragged on. Inside the White House, Lincoln prepared to sign the proclamation. His hand shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion after hours of shaking hands at a holiday reception. He paused, aware of how history would read every movement. If the signature trembled, people would think he hesitated. If the ink wavered, they would say he lacked conviction. So he waited. He waited until the tremor passed, until he could sign with the steadiness of a man who knew his place in the long arc of history. And when he finally pressed his pen to the document, he said, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." Outside, bells rang. Crowds cheered. Douglass wept. It was not perfect freedom, not yet. But it was a beginning, a turning point, the moment when the war gained a moral purpose larger than the battlefield. The Confederacy raged, insisting the proclamation meant nothing. But enslaved people made it real themselves. Thousands fled plantations. Thousands joined the Union Army. Their courage on the battlefield would prove decisive, their labor indispensable, their loyalty unquestionable. Still, Lincoln knew the proclamation alone was not enough. Its power came from war powers. When the war ended, so would its legal authority. He needed something stronger, more permanent, more undeniable. He needed a constitutional amendment. The 13th Amendment became his new battle. With every political tool available, he maneuvered Congress toward abolition. Arm-twisting, bargaining, pleading, persuading. Many told him it couldn't be done before the war ended. Others warned it would destroy what little unity remained. But he pressed forward. He knew that a nation built on human bondage could never claim to represent liberty. He knew that victory without abolition would be hollow. And he knew that the end of slavery would define not only his presidency, but the identity of the United States itself. As the war dragged on, Lincoln's face grew older, lined with grief. The death of his beloved son Willie had already broken him in ways the public could barely imagine. Now, thousands more sons, other people's sons, died because of decisions he made. He carried their names in silence. His hair turned grey. His posture sagged. He told friends that some days the loneliness of the presidency felt unbearable. Yet he did not retreat into despair. Instead, he turned inward, searching for meaning in the suffering. He wrote private meditations, wondering whether divine purpose was guiding the war's terrible course. He feared being wrong, but feared even more failing to rise to what history demanded of him. In those writings, he revealed not confidence, but humility, a man trying to understand why the burden had fallen on him. As victory drew near, he prepared his second inaugural address. Instead of triumph, he chose humility. Instead of celebrating victory, he mourned the cost. Instead of demonizing the South, he called for compassion. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, setting a tone for reconciliation unlike anything the nation expected. He spoke of the judgments of the Lord, reminding Americans that both North and South had contributed to centuries of injustice. No speech in American history has carried such solemn grace, such moral force, such quiet brilliance. Even Frederick Douglass, who had often challenged Lincoln to move faster and push harder, called it a sacred effort. But fate, which had given Lincoln only glimpses of peace, did not grant him time to heal the nation he had saved. 5 days after the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln walked into Ford's Theater, tired, hopeful, and unaware that death was waiting behind him. And in a single shot, the man who had carried America through its darkest night fell, never to see the dawn he had created. He became not just a president, but a symbol of endurance, justice, sacrifice, and a dream of equality still unfinished. And his story, carved from sorrow and triumph, lived on. The bullet that struck Lincoln did more than end a life. It silenced a mind that had carried the weight of a broken nation with more tenderness and endurance than anyone around him ever fully understood. As he slumped forward in the presidential box at Ford's Theater, the laughter of the audience transformed into screams. Mary's cry pierced the air, echoing across the room as doctors rushed toward the fallen president. In minutes, the news spread across Washington like a shockwave, pulling the city from celebration into disbelief. They carried him across the street to the Peterson house, where he lay dying through the night. Cabinet members gathered in the narrow room, their faces pale with the horror of what had befallen the country just at the moment victory was finally secured. The man who had lifted the Union from despair, who had guided it through its bloodiest trial, now hovered between life and death. All through the night, soldiers, citizens, and formerly enslaved people waited outside in the dark, their candles flickering like trembling stars. Some prayed, some wept, some whispered stories of what Lincoln had meant to them personally. They were not just mourning a president, they were mourning the fragile hope of a better future that he embodied. At 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. The Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, stood at the foot of his bed. He watched the final exhale, the stillness settling into the room like a heavy shroud, and with a trembling voice he said, "Now he belongs to the ages." But in truth, Lincoln had belonged to the ages long before he died. His death did not fracture the Union, but it fractured the hearts of those who had relied on his steady guidance. The funeral train that carried him back to Springfield became a moving monument of grief. Thousands lined the tracks in every city it passed through. People knelt as it rolled by, some throwing flowers onto the tracks, others pressing their hands against their hearts in silent tribute. In the faces of the mourners one could see the depth of the bond Lincoln had forged with ordinary Americans. They recognized something in him that felt familiar, a man shaped by hardship, driven by hope, and elevated not by privilege, but by perseverance. He had connected with them because he came from where they came from, suffered as they had suffered, and rose as they wished to rise. His story was their story, amplified. For many, he had become the walking embodiment of the American promise, that greatness could rise from humble soil, that leadership could be rooted in honesty rather than ambition, and that courage could be found in compassion rather than cruelty. In the days and weeks after his death, the nation struggled to make sense of the life that had been taken. Historians, citizens, and even his enemies began to recognize the enormity of what he had accomplished. He had saved the Union. He had ended the institution of slavery. And he had redefined the moral purpose of the United States in a way that would reverberate for centuries. But Lincoln's legacy was more complex than the simple title of Great Emancipator. He was flawed, like any man. His early words on race reveal limitations. His cautious political strategy frustrated abolitionists. His legal thinking often conflicted with his moral conviction. And yet, within that complexity lay something essential. He changed. He evolved. He grew beyond the boundaries of his upbringing, his time, and even his own beliefs. Few leaders demonstrate such a dramatic and admirable journey of moral transformation. The man who once spoke of colonization ended his life arguing passionately for limited voting rights for Black Americans, an idea that enraged his assassin. The man who once doubted the capacity of the Constitution to end slavery became the president who pushed aggressively for the 13th Amendment, ensuring slavery's permanent abolition. His growth became a testament to the possibility of national growth. And yet, the tragedy of his assassination was not merely the loss of a leader. It was the loss of the guiding hand the nation desperately needed during the uncertain period that followed. Reconstruction became a battlefield of ideas, clashing visions, and political vengeance, made infinitely more chaotic by Lincoln's absence. His ability to blend mercy with firmness, compassion with conviction, was unmatched, and without him, the path forward became far more treacherous. Still, Lincoln's voice lingered. In speeches like the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural, he had planted seeds of a national identity rooted not in conquest, but in moral aspiration. He challenged Americans to look inward, to confront their own prejudices, to work toward a more perfect union, not only united in geography, but in justice. His words survived his death because they spoke to something larger than politics. They spoke to the soul of the nation. Generations would return to those words for comfort and clarity during future crises. Civil rights leaders would invoke his message in their struggle. Presidents would quote him. Schoolchildren would memorize his lines. Scholars would debate his intentions. And his shadow would stretch across American history, shaping how the country sees itself and how it wishes to be seen by the world. But Lincoln's legacy was not only national, it was deeply personal. For countless individuals, especially Black Americans, Lincoln symbolized a turning point, a shift from centuries of bondage to a horizon where freedom was possible. Though the path after emancipation was still filled with obstacles, violence, and injustice, his actions cracked open a door that could no longer be closed. He had turned the Civil War from a political conflict into a moral reckoning. He had forced America to confront the contradiction at its core, and he had insisted, at immense personal and political cost, that the nation must emerge from that reckoning changed. Yet even as he became a symbol of hope, he never shed his humanity. People remembered his awkward humor, his melancholy eyes, his long arms swinging loosely as he walked. They remembered his kindness, his patience, his grief. They remembered a man who carried sorrow like a second skin, but never allowed it to harden his heart. Lincoln had once feared he would die without making a mark. He worried his life would be forgotten, his efforts overlooked. But in death, he became something rare, a universal figure whose story spoke to people across cultures, across time, across divergent political beliefs. He became proof that leadership does not require perfection. It requires courage. It requires humility. It requires the willingness to grow. But most of all, it requires the belief that a nation, like a person, can change its course, even when the path ahead is shrouded in darkness. When Americans reflect on Lincoln, they see not only the past, but a challenge to the future. His achievements are not a finished story, but an invitation to build a country more aligned with its ideals, more inclusive in its justice, more compassionate in its strength. He left the work unfinished, not because he failed, but because he understood that the work of building a just society is never finished. It must be carried by each generation, renewed again and again. And so, long after the funeral train stopped, long after the last Civil War veteran died, long after the fields where soldiers fell turned back to quiet earth, Lincoln remained, not just in statues or textbooks or memorials, but in the American conscience. Even today, amid division, struggle, and uncertainty, his story offers a reminder that progress is possible even in chaos, that unity can rise from conflict, and that leadership grounded in empathy can reshape a nation. Above all, Lincoln's journey reflects a simple truth. Greatness often emerges not from certainty, but from the courage to act despite uncertainty. Not from power alone, but from moral clarity earned through suffering. Not from brilliance alone, but from resilience. And that is why, more than a century and a half after his death, Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most powerful voices in the American story, a man whose life and whose loss still shape the nation he fought to save. He belongs to the ages not because he was perfect, but because he never stopped striving toward what was right, even when the path forward was nearly impossible to see. The story of Abraham Lincoln did not end the moment his funeral train pulled into Springfield. It lived on, carried forward by millions who found fragments of themselves reflected in the man who had risen from nothing and somehow managed to reshape the destiny of a nation. In the quiet fields of Illinois, where he was laid to rest, people gathered not simply to mourn, but to remember the path he had walked, from the dirt floors of a log cabin to the highest office in the land, from a childhood marked by loss to a presidency consumed by turmoil. And as the years passed, a legend grew around him, but not the kind of legend that distorts a man into myth. Instead, Lincoln became something more intimate, more human, more resonant. For some, he symbolized justice. For others, unity. And for many, he became a reminder that the greatest leaders often rise not through privilege, but through hardship. His words continued to ripple through time, settling into the hearts of generations who would come to see him as the guardian of the nation's better angels. Those words guided the United States through Reconstruction, through the Gilded Age, through depression and war, through social upheaval and civil rights movements. His image became a monument not just in stone, but in the collective imagination of a country constantly wrestling with its identity. Yet Lincoln would not have wanted to be remembered as a saint. He knew intimately the weight of imperfection. He had stumbled, hesitated, doubted, sometimes stood alone against the tides of his time. He was plagued by sorrow so deep that friends feared for his mental well-being. He carried responsibility like a burden carved into his bones. But perhaps that was precisely what made his leadership so enduring. He understood the fragility of the human spirit, and he governed with empathy shaped by suffering. He had once said, "I am not bound to win, but I am bound to be true." And in those simple words lay the blueprint of his life, a refusal to bend to hatred, to vengeance, to cruelty, even as the nation around him burned with those very forces. In the darkest years of the Civil War, when the Union's survival seemed uncertain and the death toll grew unbearable, Lincoln never allowed bitterness to overtake him. He spoke always of healing, of reconciliation, of looking toward a future where North and South might build a shared peace. But fate denied him the chance to guide that peace. And in the years following his death, the nation learned just how immense that loss was. Reconstruction fractured, betrayed by political infighting and racial violence. Hopes for equality were buried under segregation and discrimination. Without Lincoln's steady hand, the path forward became tangled, marred by decisions he might have softened or guided differently. And yet, even in failure, his vision endured. Every movement for justice that followed drew strength from the moral foundation he laid. The fight for civil rights in the 20th century invoked his memory not as a symbol of perfection, but as a call to finish the work he had begun. Marchers walked beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, their voices rising toward the towering statue of the president who had promised freedom but not lived to see it fulfilled. They came not to praise a man who had solved their struggles, but to remind the nation of promises still unkept. Lincoln understood that the arc of justice is long, that progress takes generations, and that his own contributions were only the beginning. He once said that history would judge him not by what he attempted, but by what he accomplished. Yet he also knew that accomplishments are shaped by the efforts of countless others, by those who continue the work long after a leader is gone. His story became a lesson in perseverance, not only for presidents and policymakers, but for every person who believes that change, no matter how slow, is worth pursuing. His rise from poverty became a beacon for immigrants, laborers, farmers, and students who saw in him the possibility of transcending their circumstances. His eloquence became a symbol for those who believed in the power of words to heal and inspire. His humility became a reminder that greatness need not be loud, that true authority is born from service rather than dominance. But Lincoln himself never claimed to be extraordinary. He had once joked about his awkwardness, his plain appearance, his lack of formal education. He saw himself not as chosen, but as someone who simply could not turn away from the responsibilities placed before him. He did not seek leadership for glory. He accepted it because he believed deeply in the promise of the Union and the moral necessity of freedom. And in that acceptance lay the essence of his character, a man who rose to meet the moment, because the moment demanded it. History is filled with leaders who commanded armies, conquered nations, built empires. But few leave a legacy shaped by compassion rather than conquest, by unity rather than division. Lincoln's power did not come from military brilliance or political dominance. It came from the quiet, steady resolve of a man determined to do what was right, even when the path forward was drenched in uncertainty. He once said that a house divided cannot stand. Those words were not merely a warning, they were a promise that if the nation could survive its greatest fracture, it might emerge stronger, wiser, more committed to the ideals it professed. And though the scars of the Civil War remain etched into America's memory, Lincoln's vision continued to guide the efforts to heal those scars. As time passed, statues rose, books were written, films created, and scholars debated every line he ever spoke. Yet none of these could fully capture the essence of the man who walked the halls of the White House with weary steps, who wrote speeches late into the night by candlelight, who wrestled with unbearable decisions that cost thousands of lives, and who still found the strength to offer forgiveness to his enemies. It was said that he carried the war in his eyes, that anyone who looked at him closely could see the pain of a leader who felt every loss personally. And yet, beneath that sorrow lay a profound resilience. He never stopped believing in the capacity of Americans to rise above their divisions. He never stopped believing that the Union was worth saving, not simply as a political entity, but as a moral project, a commitment to the idea that liberty belongs to all. When he delivered the Gettysburg Address, he stood on a battlefield, soaked in blood, surrounded by graves of soldiers who had died for that ideal. And in just a few minutes, with only a few hundred words, he managed to elevate their sacrifice into something sacred, an enduring reminder that democracy requires constant renewal, constant sacrifice, constant vigilance. And even now, those words echo: the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln did not merely save the Union. He redefined it. He expanded its meaning. He aimed it toward a horizon where equality was not an aspiration, but a birthright. Yet he knew that such a horizon lay far beyond his lifetime. And that is why his story endures. Because it is unfinished. Because each generation is called to write the next chapter. Because the work he began is the work of every citizen who believes in justice, who stands against hatred, who dreams of a nation worthy of its ideals. In the end, Lincoln's life stands as proof that progress is not born from comfort, but from conflict, from the willingness to confront injustice rather than ignore it, from the courage to act even when the cost is high, from the faith that a fractured nation can heal, and that a divided people can unite around shared humanity. He was a man shaped by tragedy, elevated by conviction, and remembered for a legacy that outgrew even his own imagination. And as long as people tell his story, as long as they look to his words, his deeds, his unwavering belief in the possibility of America, he will remain what Stanton proclaimed in that dimly lit room the morning he died. He belongs to the ages, but in truth, he belongs also to the present, to every person struggling to find hope in dark times, to every leader grappling with impossible choices, to every generation searching for a moral compass. His life is not a relic of the past, but a guiding light for the future. And though his journey ended on a tragic night in 1865, the legacy he carved continues to shape the destiny of a nation still striving to live up to the ideals he fought to protect. The story of Abraham Lincoln is the story of America, imperfect, conflicted, resilient, and forever reaching toward a more just and unified tomorrow.